Thank you for joining us here today. Could you talk through the three sections of Becoming Lim Tze Peng and how you worked on putting it together, given his long career?
Thank you for having me here today. Well, as you may know, the National Gallery inaugurated in 2015. And since then, we have continuously researched into ink art and expanded the remit. And this includes a focus on some of our local ink artists as well, such as Lim Tze Peng, in our long-term galleries, but also for special exhibitions like such. So for Becoming Lim Tze Peng, the exhibition, it started off as a research project, looking into our own national collection. We have currently 229 paintings by Lim Tze Peng, dated between 1953 to 2008. And many of these works are actually generously donated by the artist and his family, as well as his many supporters. So through the research, of course, he has this luxurious career, right? A very long career. There is this gap to fill, which is from the 2009 onwards until today, in that sense. So I reached out to the artist himself and his family. We also have credible independent scholar, Mr. Yo Mantong, who worked as our advisor on this project. Mr. Yo is a very close friend of Tze Peng, the artist. And together they actually coined part of his calligraphy practice, like the terminology to use for that. So moving back to the exhibition, it really is a research anchored show where we hope to bring our audience through the journey of how a boy become a man, how one grow up, how Lim Tze Peng himself grew up and become an artist and become Lim Tze Peng, who he is today, hence the title. The entire exhibition is divided into three thematic sections. So the first one is called From Da Bo to Xiao Bo. Da Bo to Xiao Bo, it's actually it's loosely translated to big key and little key. It's actually a terminology a colloquial term that the local older generation of Chinese speakers use, deriving from the Hokkien language. So the second section is called The World Outside. It looks into Tze Peng's journeys and his networks and friends, because Tze Peng is actually a founding member of the art group called the 10-Man Art Group, and they were very active throughout the 60s. It's 10 of them, men and women. Men and women, but 10 of them. And they went around different cities and areas of Southeast Asia to paint, to sort of have this cultural immersion. Subsequently, it led on to even a larger tour in, I think, in the early 70s, 1971 or 72, where these 10-man art group, together with their peers, so other art societies, like the Singapore Art Society, for example, and the Singapore Society of Chinese Artists as well, they actually made a trip to India and Nepal. So that covers this section, as well as, of course, his later sojourns or artist residency to Paris as well, Tze Peng alone. Yeah. This moves on to our third segment, which is titled On My Own Grounds. This is the section that looks into Tze Peng's looks into his artistic ventures, how it's loosely chronological as well. It looks at how he developed his own style, how he transformed, what kind of aesthetic languages he's looking at. And it's more strongly anchored into his pursuit of painterly aesthetics, as in the colors, the brushworks, and how he transited in a way or continuously navigate between the representational and the abstract.
Most of what we see in the exhibition is ink-based, and I wanted to understand how a background in Chinese calligraphy informed this ink-based practice.
For Tze Peng, well, he's born in the 20s, right? So at that time, owning a fountain pen, to be honest, a writing tool, it is quite a big deal back then. So his earliest form of writing or learning to write as a child was a brush with ink. Yeah, so that's how he started. He never really left him in that sense, because later on, when he was navigating and exploring between the representational and abstract in his paintings of different mediums, he actually went back to calligraphy to kind of rediscover and reform it in that sense to writing larger formats, for example, and also using it as a way to express his emotions. This he noted in his one of his sketchbook. Yeah, he made a little memo about that, about how calligraphy and writing those poetries, reciting those poetries from the sort of dynastic Chinese culture and history helps him to express certain emotions and thoughts that he's not able to in other formats, for example. So as his practice grow, it's almost like a parallel and intertwined trajectories, his calligraphy and painting practice. He realized that there are commonalities between the two, which is the execution of the line, and the working of the brush. It's not frozen. Yes. And so with that, I guess that brings in our advisor in that sense, Mr. Yo, because the two of them were conversing at that point, and Mr. Yo shared with me the story whereby he said he visited Tze Peng in the studio one day, and he saw him writing the cursive script, but it was written in such a way that the product of it, the end result of it actually looked like an abstract painting, because it was just a lot of lines, and gestural works. And if someone doesn't read the language well, you wouldn't be able to understand it, but yet you can still look at it and appreciate it in that sort of painterly manner. Yeah. So together, the two friends, they coined the term 糊涂字 in Mandarin, which in English we call it a muddled calligraphy. It's basically a transition or a particular style that he has created that combines, this calligraphy writing form with his painting form. Yeah. Subsequently, that led him to other experimentations as well in his painting. For example, he later went on, that really big painting, the largest work in our show. So for that, that's already moving towards more abstracts representations already. Another trajectory that he went on to apply calligraphy are his works from the 2013 to 15. I selected 3 of them. That's in the first section, 大波小波, especially the first large one that you saw when you first enter. So there are elements of this calligraphy, or rather also the stainless script, this sort of stone rubbings from the Qing and the Han Dynasty, that is all embedded to it. So what I guess in summary, what I'm saying is that from calligraphy, even though we know it as a writing practice, and he did use those lines into his paintings or transforming that calligraphy as well, mixing it with his paintings. He also extracted aesthetic elements from calligraphy and the practice of calligraphy into his other works as well, into his painting works as well.
How did the trips to various parts of South and Southeast Asia and Lim Tze Peng's participation in the 10 Men Art Group shape his interests?
Well, for Tze Peng, as I mentioned earlier, Tze Peng is one of the core founding member of the 10 Men Art Group, along with his artist friend like Chen Mei, Chu Ken Kwang, and Ye Zhiwei. So over the course of about a decade, from the late 50s, early 60s, all the way to the early 70s, the group made many art expeditions to like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, and subsequently India as well, with other art societies all together, like a much bigger tour. So each of this trip, as Tze Peng recalled, they are quite similar to like a cultural immersion program, because the artists, they will sketch outdoors, they will interact with the local villagers, they will exchange ideas as well with any existing art communities or art groups there, and absorb really all the historical and cultural sort of this creative stimuli, and also visual inspirations found in these tropical surroundings. And it is actually also in this 10 Man Art Group journey that sort of changed, or rather motivated Tze Peng to continuously to experiment in different styles. As you saw in the show, the earlier works, like say from the 60s or early 70s, they are mainly oil based. And I'm not sure if you notice in the vitrine, in the center of the vitrine of the second section, there's two photographs of him. And as an art historian, it's very exciting to uncover those two photographs, because it's the very first documentation of Tze Peng using this traditional ink brush and holding it, in that way, and ink to paint outdoors. And he recalled actually, and in an interview done in the 1963 with a local newspaper, that he met Ho Sijing, a good friend of him, on this trip in 1970 to Sumatra. And it was through their interaction that he started to consider, oh yeah, actually, don't just paint in watercolor and oil, I can also consider painting in this ink medium as well. And I don't have to say much more, because you can see how his then career has grown from there. And all the way throughout, even though he made a decisive switch to ink from oil painting and watercolor to ink, in the 70s, he continued to revisit the oil painting medium, almost particularly in his later, like the 2000s in that sense, or even from the 2000s or the 90s, late 90s. You can see works of his in that sense, and I've particularly laid out in such a way so that visitors can sort of consider and contemplate also, like, oh, how come I thought he's painting fully in ink now, but yet he still have oil works, and hopefully to do some visual analysis themselves and notice visual qualities, whereby, oh, how he's actually transiting and trying to experiment and bring the different mediums together, or bring the qualities from the different mediums to each other.
I actually wanted to turn the question now to Singapore itself. At some point, Lim Tze Peng begins to paint with this urge to document a Singapore that's disappearing really fast. So, in what ways does the history of his life and practice mirror the history of Singapore?
Tze Peng is He's 103 years old, 104 turning this year. And he really have witnessed the a large breadth or chunk of how Singapore has grown and developed, from the British colonial period to independence, to now, to how we have reached this part now. And I guess, for someone who has lived that long, he has witnessed all the different trajectories, different chapters in that sense. And in terms of painting Singapore or capturing Singapore, he's not the only one, nor he's not the first either. There's a lot of his peers and also even senior artists that came before him, like his teachers, for example, who started painting Singapore in that sense when they first migrated to Singapore, I would say. And what's unique for Tze Peng, though, and a few of his friends, is that they were the first ones to start doing public art exhibitions. So if you may have noticed in the first vitrine, in the first section, Dapo to Xiaobo, there are a few news clippings and also old photographs from a 1972 exhibition. They name it very simply, four-man exhibition, but it was held at a public, at a lobby space at a square of the People's Park complex, which is at the center of Chinatown here. That sort of motivation and desire to bring art to the public, they were the first, Tze Peng and his friends. Yeah, and this is because I have to then give his art historical nugget here, which is our art museums. The very first one was only conceived and formulated 4 years after that, in 1976. Yeah. So really, he's part of that ground up initiative.
My last question. How has Lim Tze Peng's work shaped the practice of younger artists working with ink in the region? Actually, I'd extend that to the practice of younger artists in general.
For Tze Peng, he, I don't know if you notice, or I may have missed out mentioning it, but he has a day job in that sense, where he was a teacher and subsequently a principal at a local primary school for like, I think for about 3 or 4 decades. So after he retired from that teaching position or as principal in the 80s, later on he gave back by being a part-time teacher in one of our local art school, the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, while maintaining his sort of full-time practice at that time. And I've spoken with a few younger artists, but younger than him, but older than me. So and they some of them they went on this sort of painting trips with him, like around Singapore or to nearby islands, like to Bali or in Indonesia, for example. And they've all learned in, I guess, intangible ways, I would say. Yeah. In a nutshell, Lim Tze Peng occupies a unique position in Singapore's art history for his persistent innovations in the genres of ink painting and calligraphy, as well as his ability to infuse the contemporary relevance into ancient practices through dialogues in different traditions and modernities. His artworks also allow audiences to connect with the essence of a Singaporean identity through the lens of art. So Becoming Lim Tze Peng is an exhibition and a research project which looks at how he became who he is today the artist that we all know, what his trajectory is like. It really defines or tries to argue the exhibition that his long career is not a singular linear path, but actually a very complex narrative where roads often intertwined and there's a lot of like perhaps U-turns, and it's very robust, just as his array of paintings of the different mediums show us.